Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Someone once said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. In many ways, that's been the story, particularly of scientific progress. It seems there is always someone that leads us into the future, someone whose vision and entrepreneurship and obsessive drive combine to turn the next big idea into the next big thing. This has been true from Franklin to Edison, from Henry Ford to Thomas Watson, from Bill Gates to Steve Jobs, and today Elon Musk may very well be the inheritor of that mantle. Electric cars, commercial space travel, high-speed transportation, and even new forms of education are all part of the vision that Musk sees. And his vision may be on its way to becoming our reality. As we all know, Elon Musk's disruption of the auto industry is full-blown. What we may not fully understand is the way in which Musk, through SpaceX, is disrupting the aerospace industry, how we talk about space exploration, space travel, and simply what a rocket is and does. Capturing this look into the future is my guest, journalist Eric Berger. Eric Berger had a long career at the Houston Chronicle and currently writes for Ars Technica as its senior space editor, covering SpaceX, NASA, and everything beyond. He's been a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and his new book is Liftoff, Elon Musk in the desperate early days that launched SpaceX. Eric Berger, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Jeff. Nice to talk to you.
It's great to have you here. First of all, tell us a little bit about why SpaceX. What was Musk's vision in creating this company initially?
So he started the company back in May of 2002, and it was for a couple of reasons. First of all, he looked at the launch industry around the world, and especially in the United States, and saw that, that it was really kind of set in stone, pretty ossified. It wasn't advancing. The price of launch was going up. It wasn't going down. And, he had come from the banking industry with PayPal and Silicon Valley and had seen disruption in a number of other industries. And the opposite was happening basically in the launch industry. And so he thought there was the potential for disruption. But more than that, he felt like it was important for humans to start settling other worlds. And he founded SpaceX expressly with the purpose of, one day building a settlement on the surface of Mars. And he felt like NASA was not going to get there. It was relying on launch companies that were too expensive. And so he set about to see if he could make a change or make a difference.
How much was about Mars and this idea of men and women settling other worlds, and how much was about just the business of space, as you talked about, and the disruption that went along with that?
I think philosophically it was all about Mars. He talked about that with the very first people he hired at SpaceX. That was the goal. That was what they were all working toward. And it sounded pretty crazy at the time, less so now, of course, given their successes, but it really was pretty far out there. From a practical standpoint, it did have to be a successful business. You could have all the grand visions in the world, but if you didn't have a rocket and couldn't make money building it and launching it, then you're not going anywhere. So he had to build a sustainable business. And the first step toward that goal was building a small rocket that you could launch affordably.
And talk a little bit about whether that was the basis, the idea that he could build this company and make money from it.
So there's about 1 million things you have to do to launch a human mission to Mars. But the first step is you've got to have a transportation system. You've got to have a launch vehicle that is low cost, can fly often, and can get a lot of material off the surface of Earth. This isn't like the Apollo missions, right, where you had the big Saturn V rocket and you put everything you needed on that rocket, the lunar lander, and all the supplies on a single launch. For Mars, you need probably tens of launches to get all the material you need to get safely to and from the surface of Mars. So the first step was building a transportation system. And the first step toward building that transportation system was showing that you could bring down the cost of launch. Because back in 2002, it cost so much to get people and payloads into space that, it was being an astronaut was a very special thing. You couldn't do very much economically in space because it was so expensive to get to space. It's kind of like, before we had a transcontinental railroad in the United States, if you wanted to operate a business in California from New York, it took years to get your stuff there, and it was super expensive. And then the railroad changed all that. And so the first step is building this transcontinental railroad, I guess, to low Earth orbit. And the first step toward doing that was building this small, privately developed rocket that was basically a proof of concept. That's what the Falcon 1 was.
What was the nexus, if any, between the work that Musk was doing in the automotive industry and with Tesla and SpaceX?
So SpaceX came first, a couple of years before Tesla. But there were similar kinds of things. I mean, they were both audacious, right? Because Tesla was seeking to disrupt the automotive industry, which was this large, entrenched, industry that was in the United States, had just several major players with Ford, GM, Chrysler, and then international companies. And it was much the same in aerospace, right? You had Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, then you had international competitors in China and Europe. And in both cases, these were decades-old, established contractors that he was trying to disrupt. And they were just in pretty different fields. Now, there was some overlap in the technology and the approach. And certainly he's learned from SpaceX when it comes to Tesla, and he's learned from Tesla when it comes to SpaceX. But the common denominator was Musk, who was basically running both companies at the same time.
You talk about his hiring practices and his effort to recruit the best and the brightest, essentially, at SpaceX. Is the aerospace industry and the recruitment there a kind of zero-sum game? In hiring the people that he hired, was he taking them away not only from other aerospace companies, but even from NASA?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a limited amount of really talented aerospace engineers. And one of the key things that he did was create an environment where not only would they want to come, but they would want to thrive. A surprising proportion of the best and brightest, young aerospace engineers in the 2000 and 2010s ended up working at SpaceX. And it's because they felt they could go there and make a difference. And it was less about writing reports and, making proposals and things like that. It was much more about actually building hardware, doing things. And that was the kind of environment Musk created. He wanted his employees, touching the hardware, not sitting in meetings or writing reports.
How did the rest of the aerospace industry react to this? How did NASA react to it?
So early on, before they got to orbit finally in 2008, most of the rest of the industry looked down their noses at SpaceX, because it wasn't like Elon Musk was the first person to come along and say that we ought to have a FedEx or a UPS of space launch. Other entrepreneurs had tried this, literally, a dozen or more had come in and tried to do something similar, and all had failed. So it was expected that he would fail. As he started to have success, NASA started taking them more seriously. And awarded them their first real contract in 2006, and then a much more important one at the end of 2008 that really was life-saving money for the company. And then since about 2008, SpaceX and NASA have been pretty good partners. SpaceX, moves quickly and can offer NASA, services at a low cost, and NASA provides, SpaceX contracts and money that it needs to continue its technology development.
And to what extent has it been important that there be people in the company, and you talk about many of them, that are kind of buffers between NASA and various vendors and Musk, because he's kind of an abrasive, difficult personality?
Yeah, I certainly would say he's a demanding boss, and expects a lot of the people who work for him. And early on, this really worked out pretty well, because what he did is he hired 4 or 5 vice presidents who were all in their 30s to early 40s, who had some experience in the industry. And they came in and were sort of willing to be molded by Musk, because they understood how the aerospace industry worked and how he was trying to disrupt things. And what they appreciated about him is that he allowed them a lot of freedom in what they did, and allowed them to move much more quickly than they would have at a Boeing, a Lockheed, or NASA, or anywhere else in the space industry. And then in turn, Musk and those vice presidents hired a bunch of undergraduate students or students in graduate school, sort of the best and the brightest from places like MIT, Stanford, USC, and they would get these kids like in their young 20s to come work with the vice presidents. And so, they had no real social lives. They weren't married or had spouses. They could spend 80 or 90 hours a week working at SpaceX and would do so willingly because they were inspired by this goal.
And what was the burnout factor there?
It's pretty high. You and for some people, the environment just completely didn't work, right? I mean, there were a lot of people who came to work at SpaceX and left within a couple months because, either they had clashed with Musk or they didn't, they thought the work environment was unreasonable. But for those who stayed and those who, made it, they recognized that there was a trade to be made, right? If they wanted to do something really significant with their careers, this was the place to do it because they weren't going to a large contractor where they might have a small role in a big project, or they might have to wait for government funding for a project to come through. At SpaceX, things moved rapidly. They were literally building things that would be going into space months or within a few years. And that really is a significant thing that SpaceX brought to the industry.
Tell us a little bit about the actual products in terms of one, reusable rockets, which was so revolutionary, and also the power of these rockets to get into deeper space.
Yeah, so the goal initially with the Falcon 1 was to prove that a private company could develop an affordable rocket. And so that meant basically vertical integration. So prior to SpaceX, the most common way rockets were built were someone would buy their engines from one company, the structures from another, the fuel tanks from another, the payload fairing from another company, and you would integrate all of this together into your rocket, and then you would go launch it. But of course, it was very expensive to do it that way, and you were sort of beholden to suppliers on their schedules for when they could deliver your products. And Musk really tried to do much more vertical integration and tried to build as much of the rocket in-house as possible. And so that was one way that he was able to really bring down the cost of launch. So the Falcon 1 rocket, could lift about 1,000 pounds to low Earth orbit. And there was one comparable system in the United States at the time, the Pegasus rocket. And that sold for $28 or $30 million a launch, and SpaceX was trying to do the Falcon 1 for $6 million. So that gives you an idea of the price disruption that they were going for. And then after they got the Falcon 1 working, which was a very difficult process, they were then able to take what they learned and move from a single engine rocket, that's the one in Falcon 1, to the Falcon 9 that had 9 of those Merlin engines. And that was a much more powerful rocket. And that was the one that was competitive with what the Atlas rockets and the Delta rockets that Boeing and Lockheed were selling to the U.S. government at the time. And that was at that point, 2010, 2011, that the rest of the industry really began to take notice of what SpaceX was doing, because with the Falcon 9 rocket, all of a sudden they could start to compete for Department of Defense launches or for NASA science mission launches, or for what we've seen more recently, human launches to the International Space Station. That's going on the Falcon 9 too.
Was there concern within NASA, within any organization, about the fact that, particularly with human launches, but even with expensive payloads, that essentially the payload or the person is sitting on top of a rocket done on the cheap, essentially, compared to what had come before?
Yeah, there was always a lot of concern at NASA and in the, quote, establishment aerospace industry about SpaceX. Like Musk was seen as someone who could be reckless, right? That's how he was portrayed. Or should we really be trusting this guy who tweets dank memes on Twitter with our most valuable launches? But the fact of the matter is, you're not just trusting Musk, you're trusting the company he's built. And the Falcon 9 rocket, when they got to the most recent version, the Block 5 version, it has the highest success rate of any rocket in the world. It's never failed a mission. And that it's done all that while also proving that you can fly the first stage 5, 6, 7, 8, or even 9 times. And so, he does take risks during development. He's famously said failure is an option at SpaceX, but he's not talking about like launching highly valuable payloads on the Falcon 9 or humans. Failure is an option when you're going fast and trying to develop things like the Falcon 1 or the Starship program that they're working on. But yeah, there's always been pushback at NASA, some of which is driven by a desire by companies to not see NASA gobble up their launch contracts.
And as you write about in Liftoff, some of the early efforts with the Falcon 1 were not very successful at first. There was a lot of failure that almost took the company down at the beginning.
Oh, definitely. As I said, they were trying to do things, Jeff, that had never really been done before. No private company had ever developed with private funding a liquid fueled orbital rocket. And certainly not with 150 employees, which is what SpaceX was trying to do. If you had done this with a government contract, you would have had thousands, if not tens of thousands, of employees involved in development, and it would have cost hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion or more, to do this. And they were going fast at the urging of Musk, doing something that hadn't really been done before. And so yeah, they had a lot of failures. The first 3 launches, in fact, none of those made it to orbit for different reasons, some of which were just mistakes because they were moving so hurly-burly through the development process.
How much was Mars always on the mind of people working there, even to this day, in terms of being kind of the overarching vision that drives the company?
It was the overarching vision from the beginning, without a doubt, at least in Musk's mind. Some of the employees, I think, probably were like, it's ridiculous to talk about Mars when we can't even launch a simple rocket. So I think they were probably more focused on the day-to-day things. But when I talked to them, they would all mention that Musk was very good at not just drilling down into the technical details, but also keeping them focused on the bigger picture. And the bigger picture was Mars, and the fact that he was frustrated. And this is one reason why I really like SpaceX and believe in what they're doing. He was of the mind that, look, it's been 50 years since humans have been into deep space. And, while the space shuttle was great and the International Space Station is a good program, the fact of the matter is we're not really any closer to humans spreading out into the solar system than we were during the Apollo program. And that's not right. Like, we should be moving outward. We should be pushing forward and ultimately, have this really ambitious goal of settling Mars. And so he always kept their eyes, at least one eye on the bigger picture, that what they were working toward is something greater. And I think that's part of the inspiration that he can instill in people that kept them going even through the most difficult times.
And what is his take on this idea of going back to the moon first?
I think he's all for it because it's a proving ground for his Starship vehicle. It's an avenue of funding. I'm of the opinion that SpaceX probably won't be able to send humans to Mars without significant help from NASA. That may be in terms of money, that may be in terms of technical support, because there's a lot more things, as I said, beyond the transportation system that are needed. But he's talked about a moon base being a cool thing. I think he's supportive in the sense that any plan that NASA has to go to the moon will ultimately, involve contracts being given to SpaceX for various services.
What is his view of his fellow billionaires that are also in the space business, whether it's Branson or Jeff Bezos or whomever?
Yeah. So Branson, I don't think really is on his radar, because what Virgin Galactic is trying to do is sends tourists, on a space plane, suborbital space plane, and that SpaceX is already launching tourists into orbit, which is, in terms of the energy required to get someone to suborbital space versus orbital, it's nearly 100 times greater to do the orbital flight. So he's not spent a lot of time thinking about Branson, I think. In terms of Jeff Bezos, he does, but I think it's more with amusement than anything else, because he will tell you that, look, SpaceX was founded 2 years after Blue Origin, and they've never launched, anything into orbit. And SpaceX has launched, more than 100 orbital rockets. And he says in the book, as a matter of fact, he doesn't think Jeff Bezos is a very good engineer. It was a fun discussion we had. So, I mean, I think he's glad that someone else is out there investing in this. And frankly, they do share they have the same viewpoint, from the sense that they both believe that the first step is reducing the cost of access to space. And the way that they both decided to address this is through reusable launch vehicles. And so I think he welcomes Bezos in that sense because it's another point of evidence that suggests the approach he's taking is the right one. And it really stands in contrast to the government approach, which is very 1960s in building the Space Launch System rocket, which is not reusable, which is ultra expensive, launches infrequently. And so you've got both Musk and Bezos out there saying, look, there's a better way, and here's how we're doing it. But the reality is the only one actually doing it right now is SpaceX, not Blue Origin.
How much of SpaceX is entirely Elon Musk? If he disappeared tomorrow, if he passed away tomorrow, what would happen to the company?
Well, the company keeps going. I mean, there's more than 9,000 employees now at SpaceX, and they have an excellent president in Glenn Shotwell, whom he hired back in August of 2002. So they would keep going, but they would lose some of the vision. And, the thing that I found after spending a couple of years reporting and writing this book is that, Elon is not just someone who showed up with $100 million in an idea and then turned it over to engineers. He is involved in every step of the process, in terms of marketing, in terms of purchase decisions, and in terms of the engineering details of rockets. Like, he is legitimately a brilliant engineer who keeps the company moving forward. But I think most importantly, what SpaceX might lose if something were to happen to Elon is it has this, this almost unimaginable drive and energy to keep moving forward at an accelerating pace of development. I mean, what they're doing with their Starship project in South Texas is really hard to fathom if you look at all the other space projects in history. It's just moving so fast, and it's so ambitious. And that's Elon driving it forward. And I think they would lose some of that without him there, because he is unquestionably the force behind that.
And does he want to go into space himself?
Yeah, he does. I'm not sure. He doesn't want to go to Mars right away, but I could see him, hopping on one of these orbital flights in the not too distant future. Although I don't know if his contract with Tesla or precludes that, because obviously he has responsibilities to both companies.
Talk about how he juggles those responsibilities.
Yeah, he has an insane work schedule. He over the last year or so, he's basically moved down to Boca Chica in South Texas to work on the Starship program. But he also holds plenty of meetings with Tesla, the Boring Company, and other ventures that he's involved in. And, I think he gets up every morning, starts work about 9 or 10, and then works until midnight or 2 or 3 a.m. I mean, he has a just incredible work ethic. I mean, I think that's all he really knows how to do, is he's got these goals, and he spends all of his time trying to think of ways to move them forward as fast as possible.
And talk about his willingness to participate with you in this project in Liftoff.
Yeah, so, I'd been reporting on space for more than a decade, and I think he appreciated the fact that I understood that commercial space was really the driver of moving NASA and the U.S. aerospace industry forward. And so I approached him in 2018. I said, 2019. I said, look, I think it's time to tell the story of the Falcon 1. And he said, okay. He said, come in and talk to everyone. So he just, basically he signaled his willingness to talk, and that gave a green light to everyone at SpaceX and former employees that, that now is a good time to tell this story, and that I would, try to tell it as accurately as possible.
Talk a little bit about his relationship, and you write a lot about this, his relationship with his employees, because he is so hard driving, because he is such a tough boss, that, sometimes you're on the good side, sometimes not.
Yeah. So the Tom Muller, who is the vice president of propulsion, he basically was the architect of the Merlin engine that has powered so much of SpaceX's success. After the first launch in 2006, the engine had failed due to a fuel line issue, and so he told me he was in deep crap because of that. With Elon, his relationship was bad, and he said after that flight, to sort of motivate his teams, Elon hired out a 0G flight. So this is a 727 that goes up and flies parabolic arcs up and down. And he said everyone who got a good grade after the first launch got to go, and everyone who didn't. And so here's Muller, who was the very first employee at the company, who hired on, and arguably its most important technical employee. And he said he didn't get to go because he was on in the doghouse. So, as I say, Elon is extremely good at motivating his people, and he motivates them through a mixture of inspiration, charisma,
fear,
ability to do things, and the fourth thing would be intimidation. Yeah, I mean, fear, intimidation. Like, you don't want to disappoint Elon because A, you don't want to disappoint him, and B, bad things may happen.
Does he look over his shoulder in terms of disruption that could impact him and SpaceX from others?
I don't think he fears any other commercial space company. I'm going to answer your question about looking over his shoulder, but I would say for the longest time, for the last 2 decades, it's really been looking ahead at the titans of the industry. So the Lockheeds, the Boeings, their joint company, United Launch Alliance, that have sought to sort of keep him down, right? And it's been a constant battle to push up against those guys. And now I think he's succeeded in that. And so it's time he can look over his shoulder for up-and-comers. The reality is I don't think he sees too much competition outside of China, which is investing a lot in this space industry, and maybe one company called Rocket Lab that also has had some success in commercial space and is competing for some of SpaceX's launch business.
And finally, what does he fear most in terms of SpaceX? What is he most worried about?
I think what he's most worried about is running out of time. So he, from the beginning, has sought to move fast. That is the defining characteristic, I think, of Elon Musk and SpaceX and Tesla for that matter as well. But it's like, I've got this great audacious goal of building a city on Mars. If it weren't for Elon Musk, it would take centuries to do this. But he thinks if I can push as hard as possible, it's possible this might get done in my lifetime. But he doesn't know how long he's going to live. He doesn't know how long there may be an environment where funding for this is available. And so he just tries to go as fast as possible, hoping that he accomplishes goals before the time runs out.
Eric Berger, his book is Liftoff, Elon Musk in the Desperate Early Days That Launched SpaceX. Eric, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.